Today I'm going to show you how to make these Winnie the Pooh ears. Now these will be a sewing version. I will have a no-sew version of some less complicated shapes later on. If you're a beginner sewer, this should still be easy for you to do. It's not going to be a whole lot of sewing, so you should be good there. Now I've made these patterns for you to use. They are linked, and I have one for the Winnie the Pooh, and I have one for just a regular ear as well. Each one of them also has a child size version, which is a little bit smaller, and they're kind of better proportionate wise for children under the age of 3. Now on the pattern, there are 2 shapes. This is the fabric shape. This is where you're going to sew around, and it has markings for where you start and stop. And then there's also a centerpiece, which will be for your foam. The foam is gonna be what gives your ear support. I recommend printing these out on cardstock and using that. It'll be a lot easier for you to transfer the pattern and to duplicate it for multiple ears. All right, so supplies. In addition to those templates, you're going to need some fabric. I recommend for these Winnie the Pooh ears, this yellow kind of fleece-like fabric. We get it from Joann's. You just need a ½ yard, and then also this red satin-like fabric, also a ½ yard. Now you're gonna have fabric left over, but I like getting a ½ yard because it's still a cheap amount to buy, and then you can do it for multiple ears as well. Or if you mess anything up, you still have the fabric. Now for this satin-like fabric, don't get a really cheap quality one because then it's gonna kind of snag in your sewing machine. You're gonna want like a good thick satin material. You'll also need a sheet of EVA foam. This is 2 millimeter thick. Typically you can get them in stores in sheets of 9 by 12. You only need 1 sheet. You can get about 6 foam pieces for each sheet, and you only need 4 for this ear. So 1 sheet will be fine. They also sell them in bigger packs as well. For ribbon, I recommend picking up this red satin-like finish. This is the Simplicity brand. They carry them at Joann's, Walmart, Michael's, all the craft stores mostly. Next, you'll need polyfill. Now, these bags will last you. You can get so many ears out of these, and Hobby Lobby is where I tend to find them the cheapest, unless they're on sale. For Pooh's face, you'll also need black HTV. You can also use brick HTV. We have used that in the past. You just can only find that at like specialty stores or online. If you're doing the centerpiece of the ear, you're also gonna need yellow HTV and black HTV for that as well. And this brown craft foam. This is thinner than the centerpiece. These you can also find at Hobby Lobby, Walmart, any other craft store. And then you'll also need headbands. For this design, I like using this white satin finish. They also have them in a black satiny finish. You also could get one and cover it in fabric yourself. That is a little bit more difficult. I think these look just fine. So that's everything that you need that's specific to this design in particular. You'll also need regular supplies like sewing machine thread. You'll need a sewing needle as well for stitching it up. A cutting mat might be handy, an X-Acto knife, a rotary blade, fabric scissors. You will need a Cricut and some sort of heating element like a Cricut mini press. An iron would work as well. You'll need a glue gun and glue sticks. I recommend the Gorilla Glue because that'll give you a better, it'll secure it a little bit better. And that's it, let's get into it. All right, so I'm gonna start by cutting the fabric for Pooh's face. Now, with every fabric, there's a front side and a back side. This right here is the front side. It's a little bit hard to tell because this is fleece, but you're going to flip it to where you have the 2 good sides facing each other. That way, this right here, this piece that's up, is the back side of the fabric. This is where we're gonna draw our pattern. Now, don't worry about any wrinkles. We are going to be using a heat press when we're pressing on his face, and that'll get out the wrinkles. Now for this, I'm going to use the fabric part of my template, and I'm going to draw it twice on here because again, we have it folded over, so this will give me a total of 4 of Pooh's heads. And I'm going to just take a pencil. You can use they make different types of fabric markers. I would not recommend using one that's washable because of course we won't be washing this to remove it. So something like a chalk, or there's also some that are like air dry markers, or for this, because it's a light fabric, pencil works just fine. And I'm just going to trace this twice, like I said, and then we will cut out these 2 shapes. Now for cutting this fabric, I don't need a whole lot of space. I'm just going to cut it out into 2 squares. We don't need like a large seam allowance or anything. And once this is sewn, we will go in and cut closer to the line. This is just, we want to make sure we have enough fabric to work it through the sewing machine. Now I am going to use a few straight pins. Now this is just to help me when I'm moving it to the sewing machine and when I'm feeding it through the sewing machine to keep both layers of the fabric together. This just makes it easier for the fabric not to move around. And I'm only doing this in like 3 places, but I am positioning it around where the curves are going to be because that's where my fabric is going to be moving the most. So I want to make sure that it's really secure in those areas so that when I'm turning it through my sewing machine, it doesn't get off. It doesn't separate from the bottom layer a little bit. They don't get like off. Now we're going to switch to our foam center pieces, and for this we're also going to switch the shape of our pattern. We are going to need a total of 4 of these center pieces, 2 for each ear. You can get a total of 6, like if you're making multiples on this sheet, but I just need 4 for this. So I'm going to trace along the pattern, and obviously I'm just using a pencil here over black foam. That's not going to show. What I'm doing, however, is pressing into the foam, and you can see the indented outline. That way I can know where to cut. Now once we have our 4 shapes, I like to use an X-Acto to cut out part of this shape. I'm going to use it to take down the bulk of the foam and separate the pieces, but I'm also going to use it for this curved line right here. I find that it's easier to get a nice curved shape with the X-Acto rather than using a scissor for this. While there are curves on the rest of this foam piece, this base curve is one of the more important edges because this is where your headband is going to sit flush to. There will be fabric covering it, so if you get off of it a little bit, it's okay. There will be fabric to kind of fill in the gap, but I like to make this line as close to my cutout as possible and as smooth and rounded as possible. Just that way I'm not gonna get any gaps as easily, and it'll fit flusher to the headband. Now I'm going to take just some scissors to cut the rest of this. Don't use your fabric scissors since this is foam. These are fabric scissors, but these are just for cutting my foam pieces. These will dull the blade of your fabric scissors, so you definitely want to use different scissors for these. Now, as I said before, these foam pieces will be the center support for our ears, and you will need 2 for each ear. You can kind of see they're a little bit smaller than this outline right here, than the fabric outline, and they will take up most of the ear as well. All right, now it's time to start sewing. So going back to our pattern, there is a start and stop part. Now this is going to be where we're going to end up stuffing the foam and the polyfill as well. So you're not going to want to sew along the bottom part right there, but you will sew along the rest of the outline. Now for this, we do not need to back stitch because we will be going back in and sewing the seams closed, and there also will be some hot glue attaching this to the headband, so we don't need to worry about back stitching. You can if you want to, but it's not necessary. Now for these curved edges, there's lots of curves on Pooh's face. You want to not force your fabric through your sewing machine. You want to go slow with your sewing and just kind of move the fabric slightly. You want to hold it tight on both sides as well. Now, anytime that you come to a corner where you need to pivot the head of the sewing machine, make sure that your needle is down before you slightly lift up the foot and rotate your fabric. That way you don't come off of where you're at. Now that tip will also come in handy as you work on the curve for his ears because they are a tighter circle, obviously. So what I recommend doing is just little tiny pivots along the way. You don't want any sharp turns because then his ears will be pointy. Just little small adjustments of the foot and fabric in order to help you make that tight curve. While this is a bit of a complex shape, don't worry if you get off of your pattern line at all. This is rather forgiving. Keep in mind he will be stuffed, and this doesn't have to meet up with another edge of something. Also, if your curve is like veering off beyond his head a little bit, you can come back to it and refine that curve a little bit and cut off the excess, if that makes sense. The biggest thing with this is just going to be going slow and working your fabric through it very gradually and in a smooth manner, and that'll really help make these curves. Now again, when we come to the end of the shape, we don't need to backstitch, and of course we're not going to close out the shape completely as well. We need to be able to have an area to stuff the foam and the polyfill into. So that part we will come back to in the end and hand sew it closed. Now this also might take you a few tries to get right. The good thing about this is that it doesn't require a ton of fabric and you're not that far in. So if you can't get the curves right, or it's just not looking the way you want it to, and you need to try again, you can just cut another little square out of your fabric and draw the pattern again and start over. You're not losing or wasting very much fabric at all. So that's another good reason to get a half a yard for this. That way you can have test ones. Here you'll see where my sew line is in comparison to my pattern line. I do get off of it a little bit. Like I said, it's a very forgiving pattern. It is a little bit complex of a shape, but once you cut him out and you flip him inside out, or right side out rather, and stuff him with the fluffing especially, it'll really, the shape will take form. So don't be afraid to, if you get off of the line too much, it'll look just fine. For thread for this, I am just using white thread. You're not going to see it very much at all. Depending on how tight you stuff it, you might see the seam a little bit when you flip it out, but you won't really, this won't be very visible. So it doesn't really matter what color thread you're using. However, I would keep in mind with any of these, I wouldn't use black thread on this light fabric. Then again, this fabric is a thicker one, so you're also not going to see through it as much as like a maybe a cotton fabric, but I would still recommend going with a lighter thread color. I said it earlier and I'll say it again, the biggest tip for this is going to be going slow and just slowly turning your fabric along to the same speed as the sewing machine is going. That'll really help you with the curved lines, making them smooth and not bunching your fabric as much as possible. Another thing when it comes to Pooh's ears, if you're going to be going off the pattern a little bit, try to go and make it a larger ear rather than a smaller ear, because when you flip it inside out or when you flip it right side, his ear is going to shrink in size a lot. So you don't want to cut it down into a smaller shape because it is going to lose a little bit of its bulk. Okay, the next step is to cut down this excess fabric. We are going to leave this area, excess fabric on this area. That way it'll help us when we go to stitch it closed. It'll give us more room, but we're just going to cut along the edge. Obviously, pay attention to where your sewing line is. You don't want to cut too close to that or cut it, because then when you turn it, it'll end up being a hole. So we don't want to do that. And you also don't need to get super close to the line, but any excess fabric is going to make the ears a bit bulkier, especially with this shape in particular. Like when you get into these sides right here, more fabric is going to kind of get in the way of the illusion. And of course, you'll also want to snip off your excess thread at the start and stop as you're going through this as well, just to get that out of the way. And now it's time to start seeing Pooh's head take shape. We are going to flip him right side out, and for this, when it comes to the seams, you're gonna want to just run your finger along it a few times, especially with the ears. You know, it kind of, sometimes you can use like a pencil, the end of a pencil, that might help, like the eraser end, to get in there and make sure the seam gets fully turned out. The next step is adding Pooh's facial features. I'm going to start by just ironing out the fabric a little bit, just to get rid of any wrinkles or creases before I attach the HTV. Now moving into the Cricut design space, I will have these files attached for you. There will be one of his face and then one of the honey pot and all of the pieces for that. The honey pot is for the centerpiece that is in the middle of the bow. You can, of course, decide not to do that, but that is what the rest of these pieces that I will be cutting out now are for. When you add the files into your Cricut design space, Pooh's face is going to be about 2.2 inches by 1.8 inches. You will need to resize it once it's in your Cricut space. And then the honey pot as a whole, all those pieces are about 1 inch, 1.3 inches by 1.4 inches. If you'd like me to do more full Cricut tutorials and show how I make these shapes to begin with, or any other things involved in the Cricut design space, let me know in the comments and I can definitely work on a few of those for you. One thing to remember is for the black and for the yellow, those are going to both be HTVs. So you will need to make sure that you turn the mirror on, because anytime you're using HTV vinyl, you need to have the Cricut print it mirrored or cut it mirrored. And then as for a cut pressure, just an everyday iron-on will work fine for any basic regular HTV. If you're using anything specialty, any specialty vinyls, then you'll want to adjust that for whatever material you're using. Now, also with HTV, you always want to put it with there's going to be like a shiny side and a matte side. You're always going to want to put it shiny side down, because the shiny side is going to be your transfer material for the HTV. You also won't need a ton of vinyl for any of these shapes, so you can probably get away if you have any like scrap pieces, you can probably get away with using that, especially when it comes to like the yellow, the honey. That is a very small piece, so you don't need a whole lot of material there. When it comes to cutting the foam, there are a few things that you can do. You can use a deep point blade. You can use a knife point blade, which is what I'm going to be doing. You also could cut the shape out on cardstock, trace it on your craft foam, and cut it out yourself. It's not a complicated shape to cut out. I've done that in the past several times. Now, with the knife point blade, you obviously are going to swap it out. Now, since the foam will get impressions and things like that, if something is run across it, I move my roller wheels to the side so that it is just running along the edges of my foam, if at all. And I also move my starting position, I move my shape over a little bit to avoid those first two roller wheels. I've definitely forgotten to do that before and had a wheel impression run along the foam piece right down the middle. So you definitely want to move it over just a little bit to make sure it misses those wheels. When it comes to cut pressure for the knife blade only, you are going to use this tooling leather for 0.8 millimeter thick craft foam. this is going to do 4 passes, you're going to want to stop it. You're going to want to pause your machine and cancel the cut after it's done 2 passes. So just keep an eye on it. This, with anything with the knife blade, you can't edit the material settings. So you can't change it to drop it down to 2 passes. So just keep an eye on it. Don't set it and then walk away. It'll end up cutting too much. I've done that before and it's cut through my mat. So you don't want to do that. Just pause it as it is done with the second shape and cancel the cut at that point. Now from here, it's time to weed the HTV, and weeding HTV is very easy to do because of that transfer tape that it's already kind of stuck to. It's really easy to pull off the excess and not worry so much about your shape coming up off of that. Now you'll want to position him where he looks best. Make sure that his nose is like in the middle of the face widthwise, and make sure that it doesn't look crooked or anything like that. And once you have his face placed where it looks best, you're going to use whatever heating source you're using. I like using the Cricut mini press. It is a small enough shape that I can just go with something small like this. I do kind of center it in 2 places, as you see. You could use a t-shirt press since he's flat and doesn't have any of the foam in it yet. Or you could also even use an iron. We're not going to be, like, this won't be put in the wash, so you don't have to use the highest quality heat source. An iron will work just fine to attach him without any lifting. Remember to check whatever heat settings or pressure is required for whatever material you're working with, whatever HTV you have chosen. Always make sure that you're using the right temperature to make it easier to transfer. Next step is our polyfill. So we're going to start with Pooh's ears before we put the foam pieces in. So you need a smallish amount of polyfill for this, and just kind of stuff it until you like the look of his ears. It could be however full or not full as you want it to be. I also like to take a little bit of polyfill and put it at the top of his head to kind of help round it out before I put the foam pieces in, so it's not as kind of sharp right there at the top of his head, since Pooh is a very round character. And now we're going to add in the foam pieces. Like I said before, you need 2 per each ear. I find it easiest to do 1 at a time and kind of curve it fold it like a taco before putting it inside of his face. Once the foam is in, now it's time to add all the polyfill. Now for this, of course, once again, you can make him however full or not full as you want. Just keep in mind that the more polyfill you add, while it doesn't weigh a whole lot right now, will add some more bulk and weight to your ears. Also, because this is kind of a larger shape than traditional Mickey ears, so it's kind of a nice balance. You kind of want to find a nice balance between keeping him full and round and also not having your ears topple over as easily. One thing that I do like to do, so that I'm not like compromising the roundness of his face, is to just put a little bit of foam on the back side of him, because of course that's not going to be seen as much, and it's a way to take down a little bit more bulk. Now once you're happy with his shape and fullness, we're going to close the ears. For that, we are going to hand sew it. So you'll need a sewing needle and some thread, and we're gonna just do a real basic stitch through this because it's going to be reinforced with some glue when we stick it onto the headband. So it doesn't need to be a super complicated stitch, just a simple straight stitch. Doesn't need to be super tight either. One thing I do like to do, as you see here, is fold the fabric in on one side and then fold it over just to create like a nice non-frayed seam and to eliminate any bulging fabric. Also for this, the thread doesn't really matter, the thread color, because you won't see it, but I do tend to opt for white for a lighter fabric, just in case there's a stitch that happens to be seen once I've assembled the ears fully. Once this is closed, he is done and we're ready to move on to the bow. Now, of course, if you don't want to have a bow, you don't have to do this part. You can skip it and skip forward to when we assemble the pieces together. For the bow, we don't need to worry about it being perfectly straight or anything. We're just going to roughly cut out a 12 by 9 inch strip. And then we'll also need, for the center of the bow, we'll need a 4 by 2 inch little strip as well. For the main part of the bow, you're going to fold it hot dog style with the good faces touching each other. And we're going to end up sewing along that edge. So here again, we will tack this side down with a straight edge to help keep us lined up, to keep our edges lined up when we go to sew it. For the smaller piece, we're going to do the same thing, fold it hot dog style with the two good sides facing each other and tack that down with a straight needle as well. Now we're going to go back to our sewing machine. For the thread for this, it doesn't matter which color you use because the seams will be hidden, so use whichever you prefer. And we are going to start by stitching along this edge of the larger rectangle. For this, it doesn't really matter how much seam you give it. You're just going to want to keep it as straight as possible. You can backstitch. You don't have to because we're going to reinforce it again. You'll just use a regular straight stitch all the way down the edge of this fabric. Then we're going to do the same for the smaller rectangle piece. Just stitch a straight line down the edge of it. Next, for the long piece of fabric, you're going to just cut off the edge a little bit. You don't have to do this step, but again, it's going to remove some bulk from your bow. And as you can see, we've created a tube essentially, and we're going to flip the tube inside out. Once you have the tube all flattened out, you're going to want to flip it to where the seam is on the bottom, and we're going to fold it in half. So here, this edge is now going to be the line that we stitch. You're going to want to make sure your seams kind of match up a bit and tack that down again with a straight needle. Once again, you're going to just do a straight line down this edge and cut off the excess. Now this piece we will flip inside out once again and then set it to the side. Now for the smaller tube, this one's going to be a little bit harder to flip because it is a smaller tube. You could use something like a bodkin. Mine won't actually fit through this and be able to flip inside out, so I can't use that. I have found that using the end of a paintbrush works the best. It's still not the easiest. You kind of have to force it through and work on it for a little while, moving it back and forth. But if you start by turning it and then using the paintbrush to kind of press the fabric forward through the tube, and eventually it'll flip for you. Going back to the larger piece, there are a lot of different methods that you could use to create the bow shape. The one that I like the most is using a rubber band. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by kind of accordioning it, flipping, forward and then backwards to make the ridges of the bow, as you can see here. Now, the reason why I really like the rubber band method is because once you've wrapped it around the bow, you can still play with the bow, make sure that piece is center, kind of move around the ridges of the bow to get it looking exactly like you want it to. You can kind of still play with it. You're not, as opposed to like stitching it, you have the ability to continue to fine tune it once it's in that bow shape. So I like that the best. Now that I'm happy with the shape of my bow, I'm going to grab the centerpiece and decide what the top or bottom of the bow is that I want it to be. And I'm going to attach the centerpiece. I'm going to glue it on the bottom part of the bow. So this will be the part that is going to attach to the headband. I'm going to put a little drop there and then wrap it around, cut off the excess here, and again, use a little drop of glue to attach that part. You don't want to use a whole lot on this because you don't want it to kind of push forward to what will be the front of the bow. You want to hide this. Also, as you can see here, this is a tube. So there is this, I do like dropping a little bit of glue right here to close the tube off for the bottom as it connects. And now the bow is done. We are moving back over to the little honey pot centerpiece. Once you've weeded your HTV, you're gonna repeat the same process as earlier. Now the issue with heating onto the craft foam is that it will warp, as opposed to like the fabric. The fabric doesn't react to the heat. So a trick that I like to use for this is once I've attached it, once I've got the press onto the HTV, I'll go in with an ice pack to quickly cool it down and keep the foam from warping or kind of flatten back out any warping that has happened. You do also want to watch out for when you go to add on like this honey, for instance. I should have cut off some more of that transfer so that it is not covering the word honey, because as you see here, there ends up being a little bit more adhesive that there wasn't before, and that is, I believe, due to the foam reacting with the adhesive and the HTV. So I would just cut that piece of the transfer because it doesn't have to overlap. All right, now it is time to assemble everything together. Now, when you are placing these ears, keep in mind they are going to seem, if you've done like Mickey ears in the past, these are going to seem like they're in a little bit closer than other ears because these are bulkier than normal Mickey ears. So keep that in mind, they will feel a little bit closer together. You don't want them too far out because of the weight of them and just the general size of them. What I like to do is line it up with my mat so that I know where the center point of the headband is, and then kind of just eyeball it from there, making sure they're center. And I do have those guides to go off of as well. Once you kind of know where you want them placed, it's time to go in with the hot glue. You'll want just a bit here. You don't want any seeping out. So don't do like a super thick line, and also you want enough that will secure it. Like I said earlier, Gorilla Glue is going to be the most secure glue that you can get, so I definitely recommend picking up Gorilla Glue sticks for this. Now this seam will end up being covered by that ribbon that we have, so you won't see it as much, but again, you don't want a whole lot of glue sticking out as well. For the bow, same thing, you don't want a lot of glue, and how I like to place the bow is I kind of rock it forward a little bit and then place it backward, if that makes sense. That way, if there's any glue seepage, it's pushing it towards the back of the bow rather than the front. Now we will, when we go in with the ribbon, wrap the ribbon around the back of the bow, so that will cover any seepage on that side, but I definitely, you want to prevent it from the front because there's not going to be a ribbon in front that will cover that. Of course, this centerpiece is a little bit large, so if you're doing the centerpiece, that would cover any of it, but I like to, if possible, push any of that excess glue behind the bow rather than in front of the bow. Now for the centerpiece, we're going to attach it with hot glue as well, right in the center of the bow. Then the last thing to attach is our ribbon. I like to go underneath the bow a bit, and that way you can hide the edge under the bow and just do a little bead along the seam between the ear and the headband and put the ribbon right on it. If I'm doing a bow, I do like doing it this way, where I start on the front of one side of the ears and then wrap it around the back, attach it to the back of the bow, and then wrap it around the other ear as well. That kind of gives me a nice clean edge. The ends of any ribbon are tucked underneath the bow, and this also does give the bow a little bit more support as well. It's got a little extra line of glue that gets reinforced with the ribbon. However, if I'm doing a pair that I don't want a bow on, then I would do the ribbon around each ear individually because we won't have that center. And there you have it, your own pair of Winnie the Pooh ears. If you made these for your little because you don't like wearing ears but you still want to match with them, check out my next video on #ScrunchieSunday, where I can show you how to use the same fabric to make a matching scrunchie. Thank you for joining me today. Please like, share, subscribe, follow, all the things, and I will see you back here next weekend because weekends are for crafting.